one of the reasons why we wanted to have you, Dean, is back in 2019, when you were on the platform at Midwestern's For the Church mini conference, first time I heard your name. And you were on the platform for that panel discussion. They gave out a copy of Unsaved Christian. I've read it. I've given away. I've been very touched by your ministry. Awesome. And by what you had to share. We're here in Southeast Texas and very much what used to be the buckle of the Bible Belt. And we've got this cultural Christianity all around us. Some churches would be content to kind of recover that. And so I thought you would have some things to share with us about reaching. And so take it from there, and then we'll have some Q&A when you're through.
No, I really appreciate that. Thanks for the kind words. Yeah, this is really kind of honestly my passion and my heartbeat is this conversation because I was saved out of cultural Christianity. And I think that's the key and starting point is that for far too long, I think we have, not with the wrong intentions, but we just have wrongly seen cultural Christianity as a discipleship issue. And the case I make in the book and really my entire pastoral ministry is that it's an evangelism issue. Like we're talking about two different religions here. Like we're not talking about immature versus mature Christians or, more shallow versus, more we're not talking about that. We're talking about actually two different religions, because a cultural Christian is someone who, if you ask them why they are a Christian or what makes them a Christian, the answer they would give you most likely would have nothing to actually do with Jesus. And like last time I checked, that's not Christianity. So, so back, we get mainline Protestantism and theological liberalism right. Machem, when he was professor at Princeton in the early 20th century, wrote Christianity and Liberalism, and like 1920-ish, something like that. And in the book, he said, back when Princeton was, Orthodox and evangelical, and he said that what you need to understand about theological liberalism is this is not a branch of Christianity. It's not Christianity at all. It's a different religion altogether. Until you actually understand that, you can't reach that world. And I think the same thing's true with cultural Christianity. Again, I'm not talking about someone who's drifted away for a little while, or is just sort of been a little prodigal son, or I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about someone that truly does not know Christ but thinks they do. And what really was the sort of, springboard for me was Matthew chapter 7. Jesus is talking about the wide and the narrow gates, right? There's a wide road, wide gate that leads to death and a narrow road that leads to life. And the text that's preached pretty regularly. But after that, like the example he gives, he warns of false teaching. And then the example he gives of the wide and narrow gate is not some rant on atheism or agnosticism. He doesn't go into other pagan religions or different, idolatrous acts of that time. He says in verse 21, many will say to me, so many, wide gate, many will say to me, will say to me, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name, cast out demons in your name, perform miracles in your name? And he said, I'll tell them, away from me, you evildoers, like I never knew you. So what are these guys doing that he's referring to? These are people, he's really throwing a jab at the Pharisees. And what he's saying is that these people are appealing to other means than Christ for their salvation. But these people think that they're fine with God because of the things that they have done religiously in their life. When your answer is not, didn't we do this, but it should be, didn't he do this? Didn't Christ do all this for me? And that is no category for that in cultural Christianity. The work of Christ is not dependent upon their answer or for why they think they're fine with God. So I think the most helpful thing I want to talk to you about, and I promise I won't talk forever, but so we can actually have some question and answers or more dialogue together. But I think the key is understanding the barriers that are getting in the way of us reaching cultural Christians and the hindrances. And then we work hard in our ministries. A lot of it is through preaching, honestly, to try to tear those things down, those barriers down. And I talk in the very beginning of the book, and I know you said you read it, but just to kind of review that, well, I kind of had a little bit of a complex about doing ministry in the South, or in East Texas. I kind of felt like I was sort of taking the easy route. When you go to plant a church, why would you need another church here? We have 800 churches, that kind of thing. Where my friends that were going to plant churches and be a part of ministries and establish churches in secular areas, I thought they were doing the real work. And I had a buddy going to California, and he told me that he believed where he was going was easier than where I was going back in Tallassee, which Tallassee is a liberal city because of state government in Florida State, but it's our city, just because being a government town, so much government, even though our governor's not, he's conservative, but like just liberal city. But I grew up, where I live right now, as the crow flies, is like less than 15 miles from the Georgia line. And it's less than an hour from Alabama. So as much, so the local Tallahassee, that didn't come here for Florida State or for state government, comes from a very Southern kind of Bible Belt culture. Mainline Protestantism is really big here. There's just a million Episcopal and Methodist churches that are fourth generation church members that go there and that type of thing. And he said that he thought where he was going was more difficult than where it was easier than where I was going. And I said, how in the world can you say that? You're going to Northern California. You know, I mean, I went to Liberty University, and Jerry Falwell Sr. used to call California the land of fruits and nuts. You know, and so I said, you're heading out there. And I'm going, and he goes, well, where you're going in Tallahassee, there's a lot of confusion. Where I'm going in California, there's no confusion over who's a Christian and who's not. Either you follow Jesus or you don't. There's no kind of murky, muddy middle in between. Where you're going in Tallahassee, everybody thinks they're fine with God. It's almost like they have to get lost in order to get saved. And that's when it really clicked in my head, just that quick conversation that we really are talking about an evangelism issue here more than a discipleship issue. And that's kind of shifted the paradigm of how we do our entire ministry, like how our evangelism strategy is based on believing that. Because much of Southern Baptist over the years, evangelism strategy and teaching is geared towards skeptics who are strangers. Now, I thank God for any kind of evangelism. Go get them, right? It's like I'm for all the above. But most of our contexts are people we already know who think they're Christians, but they're not. And we're not having that kind of equipping conversation. We're only talking about going to somebody at the store and being like, hey, if you died tomorrow, where'd you go? Here's a little plan I want to show you. You know, that kind of thing. And not actually being able to evangelize people that are in our main context who aren't atheists, they're not agnostics, they're not Muslim, Buddhist, or Jewish. They're really basically generic theists who think they're Christians. So the first barrier is belief, just belief in God. And that sounds strange because belief's a gift. You know, it's actually a wonderful thing. But this kind of belief is a big barrier to actually reaching what I would call an unsaved Christian, a cultural Christian, or a nominal Christian, whatever kind of language you like to use. And I call them unsaved Christians, again, because they would claim to be Christians, but their reason for believing they're Christians is not anything of saving faith. So the belief issue is that, do you believe in God? Of course I do. Why would you even ask me that? Like, it's almost like an offensive question, like where we live, right? I mean, do you believe in God? Of course I believe in God. I'm not an atheist. I mean, I might not be as religious as you, they might say, but of course I believe in God. But who is that God they believe in? Oftentimes this God is very generic, very vague, kind of big man upstairs, maybe a divine Santa, an imaginary friend. You know, it could be a kind of a moral compass or like an inspirational feeling like the Force from Star Wars or something along those lines. It's just kind of this generic, very vague God. But the issue is our God is not vague and he's not generic. He has made himself known. Like, he wants us to know exactly who he is. Hebrews chapter 1, you know, in the past, God spoke in these ways. He spoke, you know, through the prophets, through the psalm. But today he has spoken to us through his son, right? So God is not generic. He's not vague. I'm not saying you have to have a theology degree and have read 10 John Frame books to be able to be a Christian. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that a generic belief in God can be one of the biggest barriers to belief because it leads someone to think they're fine. I mean, James wrote in James chapter 2, you believe that there's one God. Okay, great. Even the demons believe that. Right? It's James's kind of way of going, okay, you believe in God, you want a cookie? I mean, congratulations. Like he's like, that's not what I'm talking about here. So, hey, who just walked in? What's up? And that was not me calling you out for being late. It was just me saying, hey. So that belief, believe it or not, a wonderful thing like belief in God, as in not atheism, can actually be a barrier to belief because it's not the actual God of the Bible. So that same God is not going to have any expectations on us. Sinning against him is not going to be a very big deal because, again, he's generic. He's vague. He doesn't ask much, expect much, demand much. He's just sort of there, and he's just kind of like me and God together, and it's an imaginary friend kind of thing. And it can be a huge, huge barrier to belief. You walk into any restaurant in Beaumont and ask somebody, do you believe in God? And most people are going to tell you yes. Statistically, I guarantee you there's not a high percentage of atheists there. In fact, it's not just a Southern thing. In America, the high percentage of people are not atheists, but they are not Christians either. So what are they? And it's not that they're even nuns. That's rising, but it's not the dominant by any means. They're generic theists that believe in this random, vague spiritual God that's not the God of the Bible, which means I'm not going to see my need for Christ because the God that I believe in has nothing to do with the fact that I do some bad things and mess up sometimes. He's okay with it because he's just a generic God, not the holy God of the scriptures. The second thing is morals, which is another good thing, right? So morals is a wonderful thing. It's also a gift, but this is the classic, I'm a good person. If I had to say what the most prominent religious belief is in America, it would be just that good people go to heaven. Good people go to heaven. Any funeral you go to, we're just so thankful that grandma and grandpa are reunited together. He missed her so much. Or we just know that Uncle Bob's fishing in that big bass lake in the sky right now, sort of thing. And we know that Steve's out there playing 18 holes in the sky, that type of thing. And the reason for believing that is simply because he's a great person. So because he's a great person, was a great friend, keep your shirt off his back, then he's in heaven right now. They don't tell us who's in charge of heaven, how you get there. Like all we know is or what it is. It's just this place where, Billy is fishing in the sky, kind of idea. Here's the thing about that though. When people say, oh, it's all about just being a good person and he was a great guy, I kind of like to come back at that in a little bit of a surprising way to people. I always go, they're right. They're right. He is a really great person by the standards of this world. They're right. There's a lot of people that are worse off than them. They're really good people. But God does not judge us compared to other people. His standard is himself. So when you think that, oh, good people go to heaven, the issue is you're comparing yourself to others. It reminds me of the Pharisee and the tax collector in Luke chapter 18, where the Pharisee said, God, I thank you, I'm not like other people. So he makes this kind of big, kind of large kind of scope of that comment. I think I'm not like other people. I fast, I tithe, I do all these things. Then he gets real specific. He compares himself to another human. And he says, so I'm not like everybody else, but I'm also not like that tax collector right there. The tax collector, his response was basically, everything the Pharisee just said about me is true. So I don't need now some spiritual resume or to show you how I'm actually trying harder. I need mercy. And he asked God for it. And Jesus said he's the one who went away justified, not the other. Jesus draws a line in the sand and says, this one, not that one. And the awesome story about the gospel in that context, we got to share with our people, is that Jesus answered his prayer. He cried for mercy and God gave it to him. Why? Because you got to know you're lost in order to get saved. And how often can being a good person by American standards of good be a blinder to us towards our need for Christ? And that's what we preach to every Sunday. It is a room full of people. Yeah, there's regenerate believers, obviously, but there's always people every week that subscribe to this generic belief in a generic God, and they think they're good people and that good people go to heaven, so they're fine. Every now and then they get a little guilty complex, so maybe go to church a few more times, make sure they're good, that type of idea. I did a funeral of a 19-year-old boy who's a believer. So you can imagine that anytime someone's that young, it's just terrible, right? I mean, 19-year-old, he died in a boating accident. It was the worst. And Christian family as well, thank God. And so we're meeting before the funeral, just as customary before doing a service, as you guys know. We just kind of go over things and just kind of sitting with them, want to hear from them what they want you to talk about. And they were very clear, like, please make sure like the gospel is proclaimed. We don't, want our son's death to go to waste and all these kind of things, but I promise you. But so they did a kind of standard service. They had different people share before it got to my part. And that was just the sermon, the eulogy, whatever you want, like not in the eulogy, just kind of more like just the devotional thought. So they had, 5 friends, brother, people like that share, and all 5 did a really nice job. They all talked about, how great of a guy he was. His name's Heath, the guy that passed away, and how shirt off your back, best brother ever, best friend, funniest guy I knew, do anything for you, all just the normal stuff. It was great. I said it was my time to go up, and I was closing it out. And I went up there and I said, one, I just want to thank, the 5 of you who have shared today. I said, I think your testimonies about Heath's life were just wonderful. And I said, I also want everyone here to know that everything that those folks said about Heath is 100% true. Everything they said about him is who he was. but none of those reasons are why he is in heaven today. He's in heaven today because Jesus Christ died for his sins and rose again, and he believed that in faith. I know for you guys, that sounds so basic. People that sit in pews and chairs in churches in the South, that they would think that he's in heaven today because he was a great guy. Like that is the most basic belief in America. I'm convinced the number one religion in America today is this religion doesn't have a title. It's just good people go to heaven. What is good? As long as I'm better, as long as I'm not that bad. There's always find someone better than you, always find somebody worse. As long as you live up to the standards of what morality looks like in suburban Beaumont, then you're fine. You're fine. So the only one people who actually wouldn't go to heaven would be like dictators, child molesters, axe murderers, those kind of things. Really, when it really gets down to it. I've never been to a funeral in my life where someone didn't say the person who died was in a better place. 100% times. But Jesus said the road is narrow. That many will say to me on that day, and I think we see that played out often in this idea of morals. The third thing is heritage. Where I say, can the faith be passed down? Absolutely, and thank God for Christian heritage, but it can't be inherited. We have to actually believe for ourselves. And a lot of people would answer, "Are you a Christian?" They would say yes, and their reason would be, "I'm a good person, I believe in God, and I come from a Christian family." They'll say things like, "My Nana is the greatest Christian in the world. She prays for everybody. She's got a Bible next to her reading chair, and she reads it every single night." That type of thing. And over time, what happened was, yeah, he's right. Nana was really committed to Jesus, committed to the church. Her adult son now claims to be a Christian. He's 50 and is marginally church. He goes on Mother's Day to make Nana feel good. And every now and then, a couple times a year, doesn't read his Bible, maybe prays every now and then in a formal setting. This doesn't walk with Jesus at all, but would still identify as a Christian. And then the next generation, his son, who's now 20, he's nothing. Like he would say he believes in God, but that's about it. I mean, he's nothing. So, but yet the entire family's maintaining this Christian family identity because it means a lot, because that's like kind of who we are as the Smith family. Like we're Christian people. We go to Trinity Methodist Church. That type of idea. They really don't go there, but there's still that identity there. And here's how this kind of made sense to me for the first time. My grandfather died about 10 years ago, and very proud man, Italian, comes from an Italian immigrant family, first generation American, World War II vet. I mean, just really everything that is great about the greatest generation, like he embodied, like truly. And I just a lot of respect for him. He's one of my heroes, but he was raised marginally Catholic, Italian Roman Catholic, but so it's a big, I say marginally, much more family identity than it had to do with anything of actually acting that out. I don't even remember my grandpa going to mass growing up ever, but he was Catholic, and he had like a rosary in his house and, things like that. So one day, I'm an adult by now, I'm pastoring City Church by now. And he's visiting my family in Tallahassee, and we're sitting down watching football in the living room. And he goes, "Dean, I have a question for you." I was like, "What's up?" He said, "I just don't understand. Why aren't you Catholic?" And he was like proud of me that I was a pastor, but just kind of saw it as like my grandson's doing good things, that kind of deal. And I'm like, "Oh no, I don't want to get into an argument with my 89-year-old grandfather on the Reformation or anything like that." So I want to make sure I answer his question. So I gave him a pretty standard answer about just like why I'm not Catholic, about what I believe about faith and the church and the scriptures and how salvation's accomplished and that kind of stuff. And he goes, "I just don't understand." Well, he got a little cranky. He's like, "I don't understand." He's like, "Your dad's Catholic." I'm like, "Pops, no, he's not." He's like, "Yes, he is." I was like, "He's in the other room. He's a deacon at our church. We're in big trouble if my dad's Catholic. We got problems." And he was like, "Well, okay, fine. Your Uncle Tim, who's his oldest son, he's Catholic." I said, "Pops, he's an atheist, like an actual atheist. Like he's a Darwin sticker on the back of his car. He reads Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens books. He's like an angry atheist, right?" It's like, he's not Catholic. And he was like, and I'm trying to be respectful as I'm answering this, but it was like, he was so off. And he goes, "Oh, all right, fine. Well, your Uncle Ted, his youngest son, he's Catholic." I said, "Pops, he's nothing. Call him right now. He will tell you he's not Catholic." He doesn't even sort of pretend to be Catholic. He's nothing. He'd probably tell you he's an agnostic. And he goes, well, that's I just don't understand, because all your family's Catholic. I just don't understand why you aren't. And I realized something that day. And this is so true in the Catholic Church. For my grandfather, being Catholic was more important than believing Catholic. And then I go, wait a second, why do I think that's a Catholic thing? How many people who are from Christian families, self-professed Christian families, is being Christian more important than actually believing Christian? And that's why there's a lot of people right now who are 75 years old and who know Jesus and have walked with God for a long time, and they insist their 50-year-old son is a Christian when we all know that he's not. And they think he's a Christian because he got baptized and prayed a prayer when he was 6. I'm not saying that can't be a genuine conversion. Jesus said, bring the children to me. I'm all for child conversions. But the whole point is, he says, to me, actually to Christ. And what's happened is we become like Catholics with how we oftentimes do children baptisms, because we treat it like a rite of passage. Like no different than you would your first communion, getting confirmed, those type of things. Okay, you're 6 years old now, you come from a Christian family, it's time to go sit. This is how it works in traditional Baptist churches, especially. You go sit down with the pastor, with your mom and dad. And often, more times than not, the pastors basically ask you, like, do you want to go to heaven when you die? And you're like, yes. Like, I think the atheists even just said yes to that question. And then they basically say, okay, great, repeat this prayer after me. So we just made it like heaven is Kansas and you're Dorothy in Oz. And if you click your ruby slippers together 3 times, you're gonna be able to go home. But we make it where it's almost like this superstitious kind of hocus pocus thing you say that like gets you in. And then we see someone become an adult and they're nowhere to be found in the faith. They're not believers. But sadly, this great evangelistic opportunity that senior adult mom and dad who love Jesus could have with this adult son, they won't broach the topic because they'll say, well, once saved, always saved. Like, yeah, amen, once saved, always saved. Let's make sure they're saved. And I wonder in Baptist life, when did it get to the point where, and I'm not claiming to be this 40-year veteran or anything, but when did it get to the point where questioning salvation was considered out of bounds? How often in Baptist life are we more obsessed with convincing someone they are saved and making sure they actually are? And I believe really strongly in assurance of salvation. Are you kidding? I mean, oh my word. I think it's a critical, essential doctrine of the faith. But how often are we more concerned with convincing someone they're fine than actually making sure that they are? And a lot of times what gets that cloudy is the heritage side of things. There's either pride or denial or just a false view of assurance that they just have been taught or just kind of assumed over time. And so as a result of that, we're seeing people that being Christian is more important than believing Christian. And I read the scriptures, the conclusion is if that's the case, they're probably not Christians. So how many people, I've heard it said, I had a seminary professor who used to say, never preach a sermon that would still be true if Jesus hadn't died and rose again, because then it wouldn't be a distinctly Christian sermon. So I'm preaching from Genesis or from Song of Solomon or Revelation. The cross is the lens by which I see these stories. So how often are people able to live a faith and claim a Christianity where if Jesus had not died and had not risen again, it wouldn't change their faith very much because it's not dependent upon Christ. And in Galatians chapter 2, I think if there's a verse about cultural Christianity that we can take in an American context and place it in and help interpret it, it is simply this. If righteousness comes by keeping the law, then Christ died for nothing. So we think that so basically the people in Matthew 7 who said, Lord, Lord, didn't we do all these things? As their reasoning for saying before God on the Lord's day. They might as well be holding up a sign with flashing lights that says that Jesus died for nothing. Because there's anything that we can accomplish on our own to be saved, it makes the death of Christ unnecessary, right? And so I think that that's what cultural Christianity is. It's a religion that has some Christian words, but it has nothing to do with the Christian gospel. And we're not going to be able to reach that world until we first and foremost get it out of our heads and systems that it's a discipleship issue, when in all reality, it's an evangelism issue. And again, I'm not talking about wayward people. I'm not talking about those who have stumbled. And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people whose answer they would give to why they're a Christian is based on their belief, their generic belief, their morals, or family heritage. And we would say, if your answer is not Jesus and what he's accomplished for us, you need to rethink whether or not you're a believer. And the fourth one was my story. It's just ignorance. Don't underestimate where people that were raised mainline Protestant, Catholic, etc. in your town where they are, because I went to church every Sunday. We were not a marginally church family. We were in every Sunday church family. And but the church I went to wasn't even that liberal. For a Methodist church, wasn't even that liberal, really. There were some people there that were, but my Sunday school teacher didn't believe that Adam and Eve were real people, so that was there. but from the pulpit, it wasn't anything crazy. It was more just what wasn't talked about was the problem. So it wasn't like they were throwing heresy every 10 seconds, like my Sunday school teacher was. It was more that it was just kind of like, hey, love like Jesus, have faith, and it was kind of this. Never told us what faith actually meant. It was sort of, it was that kind of stuff, just sort of this fluffy, be a better person, God loves you, go home kind of thing. And I went to an FCA retreat, Fellowship of Christian Athletes, when I was 13 years old. And I got invited, and it sounded good to me because if you'd asked me if I was a Christian, I told you yes, because I believe in God, not an atheist or Jewish or agnostic or Muslim or whatever. I believe in the God that, So in other words, I'm not anything else. Therefore, I'm a Christian. And I am a good person and come from a Christian family. That's what I would have told you. And I was an athlete. So it sounds perfect. Christian athlete, let's go. So I went to the retreat, and their pastor there that day, I didn't know what this was. I'd never seen an invitation before. I never had, again, zero context for anything like that. Raised Methodist, you don't do that kind of stuff. And he preached what I know now is the gospel. I didn't know what it was called. The gospel I thought was like a singing group or something, So he preached what I know now is the gospel. And he gave an invitation and asked all those to come forward that wanted to become Christians, give their lives to Christ. Well, I didn't go forward because I am a Christian, because I am a good person, believe in God, and come from a Christian family. So then he gave, and I'll clear the Lord's hand here, he gave a second invitation after, and all these people went forward. And people all the coaches were up there, and they were, praying with people. And I'm just like, wow, this is crazy. I never seen anything like this before. And I thought it was good. I thought it was a nice thing. I just didn't, think it was really for me, because I'm fine. And then he opened the Bible again, and he read from Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 through 23. When I first began our conversation with today. And he said, there's some of you here who think you're Christians and you're not. And he goes, because your reason for believing you're a Christian has nothing to do with Jesus. You've never actually trusted Christ. Jesus says you must be born again. And he explained what that meant and gave another invitation. And I got up and went forward. And I went down to the front, and a coach was waiting for me. And he goes, what's up, buddy? This is in 1993. And I said, I'm not exactly sure, but what he just said, that's me. So we just walked off to the side, and we're in a gym, like a basketball gym setting. And he sat up against the wall, and he walked me through what it meant to be a Christian and actually trust in Christ. And I gave my life to the Lord that day. I understood what it meant. I didn't have all my questions answered, but I knew that I was a sinner who needed a savior, and his name was Jesus. No one had ever told me that before. I went to church every Sunday. So I joke I'm the only person to ever come to Christ and be mad about it. Because in my head as a 13-year-old, I'm actually going, how has no one ever told me this before? How have I been in church my entire life? And my parents thought I joined a cult when I got back. I mean, they really did. And now since then, I've seen my whole family, come to the Lord and get baptized, and my brother and sister, like everybody. But because in cultural Christianity, the disconnect is they don't think that you're a Christian and they're not. They'll just say things like, well, I'm a Christian too, but he's really religious. He's really into church. You're basically the person that gets asked to pray at Thanksgiving. That's how they see you, kind of thing. And they respect that, admire that. You're just kind of that's just your thing. We're all Christians, but he's just, really into it. And so they'll text you to pray for them when something bad happens, things like that. So kind of I guess ever since then, I've had a desire to show people that if your answer to why you're a Christian is not Jesus, then you might not be. And I think it's the biggest mission field in America. I'm convinced of it. Because you look at the statistics, the majority of people in this country do not identify as atheists or Muslims or agnostics or Jew or Hindu or Buddhist. Now that could change, and it is getting more and more of some of those religions, and excluding atheism. The majority of people in this country would identify that they are Christians. And that's completely impossible. Just look at our country. There's no way the majority of people in this country are Christians. But the reason they think that is because they're believe in God, good people, and come from some kind of, and that Christian heritage might just mean for some they're American, right? And people confuse that oftentimes. So we got to reach this group. And I think it begins with understanding who they are, that these are unbelievers that just use some religious language and aren't atheists. And then from there, understanding those barriers that get in the way, and then structuring. I don't want to neglect those who know the Lord in our church. So, but at the same time, every sermon I preach, I'm thinking of the cultural Christian as well. Like they're on my mind as I'm talking. So I feel like every sermon, while I'm trying to feed the sheep as well, I'm also like almost like trying to take apart people's cultural Christian upbringing. And I'm not talking about traditional versus non. I'm not talking about like church style. I mean, like beliefs is what I'm talking about. So I take that apart in every sermon I preach without people even realizing I'm doing it. So that's kind of like the big picture view of how to reach cultural Christians, or becoming more aware of what cultural Christianity is. And I hope, if anything, and you might not have needed this, but it kind of reassures you of our like ministry area in the South, that we're not just down here shuffling people around in an over, Christianized population. We're going into a world that is just as lost as secular areas. It just looks a lot differently. Hope that was helpful.
Yeah, good. Very good. A group that I guess is a hybrid of a couple of groups you've mentioned that I've run into that has been heartbreaking is you have those who have that heritage and they have all the answers because they've heard it. And so you can ask the diagnostic questions and they can give you the answer, salvation by faith, but there's no fruitfulness, there's no spiritual appetite, and helping them assess. And I realize that's a fine line between, again, discipleship issue or evangelism issue. Yeah. But I've done too many funerals of folks who have had a fruitless life, and family members, well, I remember he at least grew up in church. We know he's going to be with us. And it's heartbreaking and frustrating.
Yeah, I think you can say the right things and know the right answers, but still be just as lost, right? And so I would say, rather than their vocal answers being, I believe in God and I'm a good person, they internally believe that, and they just, and also like a lot of that to me really goes back to a very vague view of God. Because like cultural Christianity loves a God who asks nothing, demands nothing, expects nothing, says nothing. And so I think we just have to push through on all that and just challenge it and realize that people are going to be mad when we do. I mean, like when you suggest to somebody who thinks they're a Christian that they're not, that's pretty offensive, But also in doing that, though, what I try to make sure is that I'm not trying to say, be more like me. That I'm not the standard for this, that I'm trying to put people to actually, what does it mean to know Jesus and to follow Christ? And right after, I actually had this in my devotional today, or my Bible reading, I was in Matthew 16, right? Yeah. And right after Jesus, the confession happens, where Peter says, you're the Christ, you're the Son of the living God. The next scene is the response to that, which is Jesus saying, pick up your cross and follow me. Like that's the response to who Jesus is now denying ourselves. And, one thing I talk about when someone wants to get baptized, I say, hey, look, I think baptism is a starting point. I don't expect you to have every single question answered. This is the starting point of your faith in Christ. What I do expect is for you to acknowledge that you're intending to follow Jesus for the rest of your life. That's what's happening. I think we can make sure that we're clear on that kind of stuff. And when everything's just in the context of just decisions, and baptism numbers, we're in danger of a lot of cultural Christianity being fueled and false converts happening.
A lot of people that I've come into contact with, talking to them about Christ, well, I've been baptized. And their understanding of Christianity or becoming a Christian is that act of baptism and having to explain, that's just a mirror reflection of what actual true salvation is. And so I feel like that's a struggle that a lot of people have, understanding what really is salvation as opposed to what culturally, heritagely they've been taught.
Infant baptism makes that really complicated for us, because a lot of people, when they point to their baptism, they point to an infant baptism. That can be because, like, good grief, like oh, I've been baptized. Yeah, you don't even know about it. And that can be complicated because the family points to that too. But for those who've been baptized by immersion as 6 years old, 7 years old, okay, so I've been baptized. Great. What does that mean? Like now what? And also, do you think baptism saves you? I mean, we have to ask those kind of questions. Some people speak about baptism. So baptism, I think baptism is our public declaration. That is our, confession of faith, as in making Christ known, or our desire to follow Christ. That is our public declaration. So, okay, what does that mean? So I think we just have to push, I think we need to spend more time talking about what baptism actually is and what we're saying when we get baptized. Won't it just being hey, all right, to join the church, you got to get baptized, fill out this form, that actually having pastoral conversations. We have a baptism team at our church. It's one of our deacon functions. So we have elders and deacons, two separate, governing, or two separate, I guess you could say, classifications and offices. What I was looking for is offices, two separate offices. And so our elders provide leadership, and our deacons serve, the Bible calls deacons to. I don't see anywhere in the Bible where deacons are making decisions and the ones that vote and approve candidates and all that kind of stuff. They take care of orphans and widows. So we have our deacons serve. One of the coolest teams, I think that's so rewarding for you'll hear them talk about it, is our baptism team. And they're the ones that when someone indicates interest in baptism, they're calling, they're having a conversation, they're walking with somebody through it. And it's just really neat, and it's not this big, we're not trying to put this big barrier in the way. We don't want to be, what's keeping you from getting baptized, like the eunuch said to Philip. It's not that. It's just helping people actually understand what they're doing, what they're saying, and what this means. And there'll be certain times where it's maybe baptism isn't right now what you need. Maybe you need to talk more about what it means to follow Jesus. That's not most of the time. Sometimes that does happen, but it allows a great relationship to happen, great conversation, those type of things. But when the Bible tells us to remember our baptism, that is not in the context of pointing to it as your justification. Rather, what exactly were you confessing in that baptism that brought about your justification? So don't be afraid just to push through that.
So we have to watch out that we don't inoculate people against Christianity by giving them something that deadens them, a false Christianity.
Sure. Yeah. And also, we're not trying to put up all this yellow tape for you becoming a Christian. We just want you to know what a Christian is and what a Christian is not, because we care about your soul. You know what I mean? So, I don't want that on my hands, of this kind of, presenting this sort of half-baked version of what it means to be a believer. And if anything, we need to fall short. If we're going to fall short on making sure that our understanding of being a Christian has everything to do with what you do with Jesus Christ and who he is and what he's done.
Dean, it was always a struggle for us. My wife and I were missionaries with NAM in New Mexico, working with Native Americans, and we would have mission teams come out and they would serve in an area, and we would do the follow-up to attempt to plant a church there. And there would be no spiritual appetite. Well, of course, among the Navajo people, if you bless them and they think responding to your invitation will honor you, they will do that. And when Sammy uses the word inoculating against the gospel, that's what happened. They've had so many people ask, do you want to go to heaven? Say this prayer, give a short, either miscommunicate the gospel or abbreviate it so much that there was no understanding, that when you go into these communities now, they're not even listening, because they have been convinced so often, A, you've done this, you've been saved, and B, you're secure in that. Many of them are syncretists. And so, I appreciate the stress on a very clear gospel presentation, because when they hear the other for so long, they almost don't have an ear for the truth anymore.
That's well said, and I think that we have too often made the gospel who wants to go to heaven when you die. And the solution is repeat after me these words. I'm not against the sinner's prayer. I just think it's a tool. That's all it is. It's not the only way to lead someone to Christ, but it's just, if we just see it as a tool rather than the actual means, I think that's going to help us a lot. Because far too often I think it's seen as like the magic words, type of idea, where I didn't like pray some detailed sinner's prayer. I was explaining the gospel, and the person asked me if I wanted to follow Christ, and I said yes. I said yes to Jesus, right? And then he prayed for me. At the same time, I think that saves you just as much as the person who sits down and prays word for word the sinner's prayer with Billy Graham, kind of thing. It's a tool, right? So I think sometimes just that, like, just kind of, we've got to make sure it's not a rite of passage or a bait and switch. Yeah.
And like you said, that's the hard thing in this area of the country that we live in. It's the cultural Christian is so strong here. I grew up in a Christian family. My grandfather was a Baptist pastor. So all my cousins, they all went to church. And so they all have this mentality that because when they were a kid, they prayed that sinner's prayer, that gives them license to do whatever else they want to do. Of course, I think that goes against half the stuff that Paul talks about in the book of Romans.
Sure.
That's, it was a struggle for me as well. So I really identified with your testimony. I was a 5-year-old. I went down scared to death that I was going to go to hell if I died. And the pastor, or the guy that was there speaking, said, "Hey, I want you to go home and talk to your mom about this." Next thing I know, I'm calling grandma and grandpa and telling them, "Hey, I got saved," and don't remember anything about it. I don't remember praying a prayer at all. I remember being baptized, but I don't remember anything about it. I was 17 years old before I finally came to that conclusion that I had been living this lie of a Christian life, that I've just been going to churches and trying to be a good person rather than living a life that is radically changed because I am following Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, and my salvation. And so it rings true with me. So I preached this a lot. I can't tell you how many. I've been in my church for 2 years here, and how many times I've quoted Matthew 7 has been probably more than what they want to hear.
I keep bringing it. That's huge. That's huge.
Hey, Dean, it's one thing for us as pastors and shepherds to be convicted of this. How have you helped your church to embrace and wake up to the understanding that not everyone that we see that claims to be Christians are truly converted?
Yeah, I think the huge thing has been that a lot of them, when you talk about it, they have someone come to mind immediately. And a lot of them, actually, it's their same story. They were saved out of it. So I think that's the biggest thing is it's undeniable in their mind, because you just have to really, I basically just really stereotype and paint a picture. And then when Rick Warren did Saddleback Sam back in the purpose-driven church days, I don't know if y'all remember all that or read all that, but like I basically do a version of that with a cultural Christian in Tallahassee. And I just kind of like paint the picture of who this person is, what they believe, add a little bit of humor to it, kind of make fun of local culture a little bit, that kind of thing. And then I say, I guarantee you, and I said, I can see heads nodding, that there are peoples in this room right now who, as I have talked about this, have people pop in your head. And not in a judgmental kind of way, in a, oh my gosh, that's my friend, that's my husband, that's my mom. We see a lot of marriages where one's a believer, the other's not, but they don't realize that. The wife knows, the spouse knows, like it's always known, but the other spouse doesn't. We see that happen a lot. So we do we do prayer time in the same way we pray for our, missionaries in other countries we have with the IMB. We will have people pray for their friends in town locally, who don't know Christ, but think they do. And so we just have basically what we did was, someone told me that read Unsaved Christian early on. I don't think this, I'm not that, hopefully that arrogant, but but they said this, that it kind of helped them create a category that didn't really exist in their mind. And people have always said cultural Christianity and nominal Christianity, but again, they saw it more as like people who just kind of need to get it together. Just get more serious about God. Let's just get more serious about Jesus, get back in church. They didn't see it as an evangelistic category. And that's the key. So our church sees it as like saying like the words like unsaved Christian is like a regular part of speech in our church. I used to do a sermon series before the book ever came out. The book was like a result of me thinking about this for a long time. And I did a sermon series called Southern Comfort. And the series kind of launched the whole thing. I didn't know it at the time, but it was looking at, this is like 10 years ago. And it was looking at how our comfort where we live is in like our heritage and being Southern more than it is, or being a Texan, God bless Texas, right? Stars at night are big and bright or whatever, like it's that kind of idea that's almost the religion, but it has some theism tacked onto it. Right. So I think, that became really just a big part of our conversation. It's like, wait, is our comfort in our salvation in Jesus, or is in the fact that I wear a Columbia shirt, croquis, go fishing 4 times a week, and back my truck into a parking spot? That kind of idea, which are deep South kind of things. So like that. So like God's not going to ask you if you're a Texan and have Texas values. That kind of understanding. God's not going to ask you if you were patriotic.
Sure.
And I'm patriotic, USA, right? So yeah, God's not going to ask you any of those kind of things.
Guys, anything else?
Yeah, so we've talked about diagnostic questions, things that we typically do when we're trying to evangelize somebody that's a skeptic or
Yeah.
But like Jim said, alluded to, I mean, a lot of people in our context and in yours see those questions coming a mile away. They know the answers, by heart. What are some better ways to engage an unsaved Christian, maybe that's even a member of one of our churches?
Yeah.
We even suspect, we don't know. I mean, obviously, don't know it's hard, but what are some better ways to engage somebody in dialogue, some key questions, things like that?
So here's what it looks like for me, and like the content of the conversation is different, but like the basic like scope of it is the same. I'll say something like, "Hey man, like I've seen you at church from time to time, or I've seen you post a Bible verse on social media, or like you like Tim Tebow or something like that." and I just realized we've talked about our family, we talked about sports, we talked about politics. We never talked about our faith before. And I'm just curious, man. Tell me your story. Like how'd you become a Christian, or are you like that kind of thing? And it's not a gotcha. It's just that kind of like very non-threatening kind of thing. I just realized we never talked about that before. Like, I'm just curious. And the answers they will give you is the scale. It's the belief, morals, heritage, that type of thing. And you'll be like, oh my gosh, he just gave the cultural Christian talking points I just heard about in our Zoom session over lunch last week. And then that just gives you a wide open door to go, okay, I hear you. Let me tell you mine. And then just kind of start asking some questions based on that. Like, so I'm just curious, do you see any difference at all in our stories? Not that I'm not saying I'm better than you, but like one thing I'm just curious, I just didn't notice was you didn't really talk about Christ very much. And about like your conversion. Like, do you think that's an important part of being a Christian or not? And then just kind of go from there. That's really how I do it. I kind of give that, hey, we talked about everything. And I've noticed lately, you that you put on, on Facebook that you asked for prayer for something, and, that kind of thing. And I'm just kind of curious. What's your background? Did you grow up in church? You can start that kind of question, like ask a cultural Christian question. Did you grow up in church? Oh yeah. Okay. Do you go anywhere now, or what? And then just kind of goes from there. That really, I'm not trying to oversimplify it. That is the key with it. But we're not trying to do 4 spiritual laws of the cultural Christian, 3 circles. I love all those things. The cultural Christian is more just helping them see how their answers are actually not what the Bible would constitute as saving faith. And that's probably going to be a 2 or 3 part lunch, like a couple different meetings after that, because it's going to kind of rock their world. A little defensive at first, going to kind of rock their world. but then like that really helped them see it. But I think the key is just keeping it about this, like, hey, I just want to get to know you better in your faith. And also just make sure your story is, as you kind of encourage congregation members, that the story they tell is not, hey, I know I said this earlier, but it's not, hey, be more like me. Because if a cultural Christian, that's usually what they think first, is that you're telling them they're not as good as a Christian as you are. That's their mind. I mean, when you're not saying that at all, you don't care at all about that. Like, their mind goes to that. You're saying, oh, you're the really good Christian. I'm not, oh my gosh, so judgmental. I'm sorry, I'm not a pastor, that kind of thing. That's not what you're saying. Just got to make sure they understand that. That's like 99% of the time, that's what they think in their head, is that you're just trying to tell me that I'm not a good enough Christian.
But
It's like I've
encountered with parents, like when you talk to parents whose kids, and older parents whose kids, you think they've walked away from the faith, have done through. When you sort of prod at, they want to say they prayed the prayer, they were baptized when they were 6, but when you prod at it for them, they get defensive.
Yeah.
They're more concerned about their reputation as parents.
Yeah,
and not
totally.
that,
Yep. 100%. What are you saying about my parenting?
Yeah.
Your kids aren't perfect. Your kids aren't perfect either.
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm not saying they are. But in their mind, that's what you just concluded.
Yeah. Guys,
That's all I got.
It's been cool. I hope this is helpful.
I made a profession of faith when I was, 10. And then 2 years later, I got saved. And, I had to get rebaptized again because really the first one was just a lie. And I was ignorant, like I said. And that's somewhat common. You were 5 and then you came back when you were 17. How much do you think this happens that Christians kind of have to reject that, but they go through that? I guess you could say.
So, you can get me in Baptist trouble here. I think a lot of it comes from the cultural pressure of baptism numbers. I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but like we put no caveat around it. It's just like they had this many baptisms. They led the association in baptisms. They get a plaque for it. And it's like, what? Kind of thing. And it's just part of the culture, right? And so my thing I'll say to parents is, why be in a rush? Like, I'm not saying John Wooden used to say, be quick, but don't hurry. Old UCLA basketball coach. Now with the gospel and us creating Christian conversation in our house, we should do that out of the gate with our children, right? But in terms of baptism, which I do believe is a starting point, I don't think you have to have every question answered, but like the goal is not to get our kids in the kitchen to ask Jesus into their heart. That's not the goal. Our goal is them, again, it's not a rite of passage. Our goal is for them to understand the gospel. And they can understand it, absolutely. They can understand, they can understand 3rd grade math. They can understand the gospel, right? It's foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us, like it's the power of God, right? Like God gave it to us to understand it. But I think a lot of times there's just built in for the pastor, it's the baptism number pressure. The average Christian would never care about that. For the family, it's more that cultural, right? And I don't think they mean any harm by it. I think they just think that like, it's almost like a fire insurance, kind of like, let's get this done, like a checklist. No different than like when a Catholic family has a baby, they might have been in mass in years. They sprint down to get a baby christened, right? And it's the biggest deal in the world. Family comes in, there's a banquet after, there's a party afterwards at the house. It's the biggest deal in the world. We can do that sometimes with the whole asking Jesus into your heart baptism kind of thing. And I know there's nuance there because it's like, okay, but we don't want to discourage kids from getting baptized either. So I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that we need to have just a little more discernment and a little more pump the brakes and ask, like, what's the hurry? Let's trust God here, right? Like, let's trust God with this child's heart. And you can have a million faith conversations. You can pray with them, read them the Bible, let them read it to you. Just help. Just the goal is not a prayer, right? The goal is gospel understanding. I just think we have to make sure that's how we're thinking. I cannot tell you how many people show up at our church. We have a big college ministry in our church and with Florida State here, and they'll want to get baptized. We got to like, oh, good. Like, they're already believers. And so we want to hear their story. So they'll say, well, I got baptized when I was 6, but like, it wasn't really my decision. that kind of thing. It's like, oh boy, want to be really carefully around just baptizing you again because you got emotional one day at church or something like that, because we don't want to be a double baptizing, or we want to call it church. But so oftentimes they aren't kidding. I mean, they really, truly were not converted. They had no fruit after that. They weren't sure of the gospel. And they come to us as 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds and get baptized. Like, it happens actually kind of regularly. We tell people, we sometimes will be like, no, you're fine. You were definitely a believer then, like based on how you have told us your story. You just are nervous or something about it, or whatever it might be, but more times than not, it's, oh gosh, okay, yeah, you're right. You weren't really ever, mom and dad are a little hurt feelings for a second, but it's all right.